Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time. Over. Solid copy. Hitman 2-3, Echo 5 Foxtrot. This is Hitman 2 actual.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Chris Bryan. He is the author of the book Cedar Mountain to Antietam. Let's see if I can get it in there so people can see it without a glare. That's always my biggest challenge. So, Chris, thank you very much for coming to the show today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Very cool. So the book, Cedar Mountain to Antietam, it's about the Army of the Potomac's 12th Corps. And you and I were talking before the recording, and like nobody knows much about 12th Corps. If you're an aficionado, you might know, okay, the Slocum's Corps at Gettysburg. You might know a little bit about Pap Green and Culp's Hill, but it doesn't kind of get the press. It seems like every corps has its reputation from Gettysburg, and you've got, First Corps and Reynolds and the Black Hats, Second Corps and Hancock, Fifth Corps, Sykes Regulars, Three Corps, Sickles, and that's where all the excitement is. And if you talk about the other corps, you're bagging on 11th Corps, or you're talking about 12th Corps being slow to get up on day one of Gettysburg. And you took this really interesting tack of Gettysburg doesn't even get mentioned in the book. So I'd like to find out what made you decide to research 12th Corps and what your methodology was.
Sure. And 12th Corps has been getting a little bit more press lately, it seems like, with Gettysburg. It's still kind of second shift to things happening on, say, Little Round Top or other parts of the field, but it's been getting a little bit more play lately. That said, it had a lot of interesting activities at Antietam, at Chancellorsville, that most folks don't know a lot about. Some do, but most don't. And really where this started, it didn't start with the 12th Corps so much as I had a little extra time on my hands before starting a master's degree, and decided I wanted to learn as much as I could about Antietam. And in the process of doing that, it became apparent that a portion of the 12th Corps did some really great stuff at Antietam, but it didn't really get covered as heavily as other parts of the battle. You have the standard sort of 3-part breakdown of Antietam. This is like part 1.1B kind of is what happened to them. And so I then kind of decided, all right, well, the 2 brigades with Pat Green going from the East Woods to the West Woods and defending the Dunker Church Plateau really could use some extra coverage. I decided I should write a book. My wife said, "What qualifies you for that?" And then I really wanted to do it. So I started down that road, and really it soon became apparent that, okay, well, if I'm going to tell that story, George Henry Gordon's brigade that was just north of the cornfield, Confederate attacks were slamming against that at the time that Greene rolled into the Confederate flank. That needed to be part of the story. And now I'm at 3/5 of the Corps. So, well, okay, maybe it should be a Corps study. And with a little bit more looking around, I learned a little bit about Cedar Mountain and realized, well, this story, this historic narrative is really, I guess, richest, best told when juxtaposing the really near victory over Stonewall Jackson at Cedar Mountain that turned really bad really fast and led to really high casualties, and the sort of interim period during Pope's Second Manassas campaign that was completely miserable, really broke the Corps down. If you showing that historical narrative followed by what they're able to do at Antietam, I think it laid out well. I will see what other folks think, but I think that was a good way of kind of scoping it. So it grew from, what ultimately ended up being about 3 or 4 chapters of the book. It grew very quickly into 2 battles and, and a whole Corps study. And then what ended up happening at the end of all this, I didn't really plan it necessarily, but it became apparent later that it's really more of a campaign study following this Corps rather than a unit history that you would typically think of as a unit history. So, I mean, the focus really is, on the Corps, but it's kind of the window following the activity sort of is a little bit wider than the Corps. It follows, I mean, I get into some, I think, significant detail of their Confederate component or opponents, and then also the other Union units that are sort of near them, right, and what they're doing. And of course, I give the overall context as well. But that was sort of the methodology, I guess.
It worked great. I got to admit, it's in my limited experience. I'm not a Civil War expert by any stretch of the imagination, but it's almost unique in the hybrid you created, and I really like it because, as you indicated, if you're doing a pure unit study, then the enemy gets a cursory look. If you're doing a pure campaign study, you're talking about a very finite amount of time. It's interesting here because never before when I've read a Civil War book have I realized just with such immediacy how the late summer and fall of 1862, you rolled rapidly through almost 3 distinct campaigns within 90 days or a very small amount of time. I mean, these guys were moving, hooking and jabbing nonstop for a significant amount of time. And it just comes through in this book. And I think it's the fact that you focused on a large enough unit, but then gave enough context that overlapped campaigns and included what the other side of the mountain looked like, with including the Confederates. It created a very full picture. And so this hybrid unit study, campaign study, it worked beautifully. And I think it's just I hope to see more of this in the future, to be honest.
Thank you very much, Brett. I appreciate that. Yeah, and as you were talking there, one thing I wanted to point out, something about this book that I like is the kind of middle period. It's that kind of really long chapter in the middle that really talking about the Pope's Second Manassas campaign, and that kind of stretch along the Rappahannock River where they're basically artillery duels every day for about 5 days. And you have incursions across the river on either side. There's a lot of interesting things going on. It's I think a really important period that hasn't really gotten covered a lot. John Hennessy covered it in his book, but beyond that, it hadn't really been covered at all up to this point. So it's and so I was able to get into some detail about this corps, a little bit about Sigel's corps, not a lot, but a bit about Sigel's corps as well. Anyway, point is, I think it's an important period.
Definitely. So it sounds like you wanted, and I'm just reiterating what you stated, Antietam was your initial focus. Then you found this organization that didn't appear to get the credit it deserved because its actions were kind of overshadowed by other things that were happening in, like you said, the traditional interpretation during phase 1, as it were. And you started pulling that thread, and the result was a core study on a very finite snapshot in time. Did you deliberately go back to before Cedar Mountain because that's the birth of the Corps, or did the story lead you there anyway?
I did. So normally when I went back to Cedar Mountain, normally you'll have some sort of preamble type work going on anyway, right, to lead up to that point. There's not a lot of time before Cedar Mountain in the period when the Corps was formed as the Second Corps Army of Virginia and the fighting at Cedar Mountain. So it sort of made sense to do that. I also was able to discover, so the Corps was formed in June 26th, and some of it had been together before that. They part of the 1st Division had been together. They fought at Winchester, and that didn't go well. But this is the first point when the Corps really came together as it would exist at Antietam. And I don't talk a lot about the movements from June 26th until they show up at Little Washington around July 17th, 1819. That's really where the narrative kind of kicks off, is mid-July. And there's an event at the end of July at Little Washington. Banks holds a grand review. That's Nathaniel Banks, he's the Corps commander at the time. And they do a lot of extensive drills, and they then form into hollow squares, and they have his cavalry guard charging against the squares, kind of a la Waterloo. So it's really sort of this anachronistic activity. And one of the Massachusetts guys calls it sham battles. And there's a lot of detail on that day though, and it allowed me to kind of like circle back and introduce people and talk about, you know, what they did leading up to that activity. And I just keep kind of circling back to that July 28th event. There's a lot going on there.
Oh, very cool. And very soon after that, obviously they find themselves in combat. So the Cedar Mountain aspect of it, where they, you know, almost defeat Stonewall Jackson, what do you want the readers to really take away from that narrative? Is it the professionalism of the Corps? Is it that, you know, Stonewall Jackson wasn't necessarily, you know, 10 feet tall and bulletproof? What are we taking away from that aspect before the setup to going into the Maryland campaign?
Well, the experience is, I mean, at the end of it, the experience is kind of demoralizing, right? Because they suffer such extensive losses, especially Samuel Crawford's brigades, about 50% losses. You have, you know, the Corps is kind of broken down with in that brigade. You know, almost all the field officers are either killed, wounded, or captured, and one of the regiments, all the company commanders are casualties. So, and then, you know, they're left with like a captain leading the regiment and just a couple companies with sergeants and corporals leading those companies. So pretty badly worn out. Brigade staffs, staff members end up going back to their original regiments to fill company commander roles. So now you have brigades that are not functioning nearly as well as they were before. One of those company commanders, former company commanders, staffer back to company command, is Robert Gouldshaw of the Massachusetts 54th fame. So he shows up in the book too. But it's that sort of condition that then kind of degrades further over Pope's campaign. That's the real kind of takeaway. You're absolutely right about the Stonewall Jackson not being bulletproof, because he and his command were not in top marching form the couple days prior to that, which largely led to things rolling out of hand for him, because not everybody was on the field when he expected him to be. He had other problems with some, you know, division commander getting killed, and that's where you have, I think he was the only guy who probably knew Jackson's ideas for how he wanted to execute on that side of the field. And so that's where that started to unravel a little bit. So those are the main things. I think I'll probably come up with something in a few minutes too.
No worries. But that really opens the door to some larger questions as the book advances, because you just identified significant loss of leadership, significant demoralization of good troops. And if we're talking that many casualties where you've got corporals and sergeants leading companies, you know, you've lost a lot of infantrymen as well. And these regiments, and indeed the whole Corps, need to reconstitute relatively quickly. Actually, relatively is not even the qualifier, very quickly, because they're immediately going to be, you know, dealing with more combat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you're rolling in to you have a company command or a captain leading the regiment that was up to that point led by a colonel who that regiment very much trusted, and he was actually the de facto brigade commander at Cedar Mountain, but he got mortally wounded. The effect on those troops has to be pretty bad, right? They don't have a lot of they actually didn't have a lot of trust in their brigade commander. You see that as they're going into Antietam, and then they lose that colonel that they really appreciated, and that has to be a sort of demoralizing cumulative effect for those folks.
Understood. And so how in the course of your research, did it become apparent how they were able to, you know, reconstitute to even be combat effective, to even be able to keep driving on? What was the secret sauce, as it was, that kept them together?
Well, it sort of varies, I think. I mean, that brigade that I was talking about didn't. They picked up 3 new regiments, and they're the ones who did a lot of the fighting that brigade did at Antietam, but the brigade didn't do much, right? And effectiveness is really sort of the other ones. They, like I said, the veteran enlisted men in that brigade weren't, did not regain their morale completely. They did get in and fight. The 10th Maine stood in and fought for quite a while. And in fact, one of the veterans was surprised how long they did. A big portion of that they had cited was the arrival of the new Corps commander, Joseph Mansfield. He showed up on the 15th, and this veteran, John Meade Gould, who's pretty famous, he had said that he inspired the men. Another regiment from the 27th Indiana, a veteran from that regiment, had said that finally we think we have a leader capable of leading us to victory. Of course, most folks know he died about 5-10 minutes was mortally wounded about 5-10 minutes into the battle. So then we jump back to Meade saying it was pretty blue time. And once that they figured that out that had happened, and it was a surprise anybody even stayed in at that point, talking about these veterans in that brigade that were so demoralized, and people started falling back to the rear pretty fast and finding excuses to do so. Now that said, a lot of the 10th Maine people, their major was leading them at the time. Their colonel and their lieutenant colonel were both wounded badly at the beginning of that battle at Antietam. A lot of them, when they saw Greene's people coming into action, joined the 28th Pennsylvania and fought with them for the rest of the day. So for a bunch of veterans who were really demoralized, they really kind of stuck in there. Now, I mean, to the larger question, kind of across the board, the other brigades weren't as badly handled at Cedar Mountain. They had bad casualties. I say it wasn't as bad as like 25% for some of them. All right, that's still pretty bad. But they were in better condition. And for everybody, once they crossed into Maryland, things started to improve for morale. Part of that is, everybody was infected with the Army of the Potomac that they just joined, seeing McClellan, and they were all very excited about that. That sort of spread to most people in the new 12th Corps, because they had not fought with McClellan before. Logistics, everything that they needed started to come in, and they could see that the Army was moving in an organized manner, which hadn't been the case for the weeks prior to that. They were moving north through Maryland, and they could see the three columns moving north. They could sense the organization. McClellan has his issues, but he did that quite well, and it gave them some extra confidence. Entering Maryland, they were sort of in Northern Territory. The effects of that, plus the citizens would provided a lot for them. Now, some of these new regiments were going around stealing things, which was not good. But generally, the citizens would be out there providing things, all sort of delicacies. And then at one point, I think it was in Rockville, there were civilians out with buckets of whiskey, passing that out to the folks. So they like that.
Very cool. So that you've segued beautifully. I've got like 3 or 4 different questions that I want to explore as we get into Maryland. The first question I want to talk about is, because you're indicating different geography, Rockville. How much on the ground research did you do? Walking the terrain and seeing where these guys actually fought.
So I've been to Cedar Mountain a few times and went over that. Not all of the property is owned by the park, so it makes it a little harder. And the terrain, vegetation's changed a little bit, right? So some places that were wheat field are now woods, and kind of vice versa. But I've been over that ground a bit, and it is on the whole well preserved, though. Antietam I've been over a lot. Now I haven't spent a lot of time driving the path between Cedar Mountain and Antietam, because a lot of that's quite changed anyway. But yeah, I've gone over Antietam kind of from every angle, and then with some topographical maps and trying to figure out exactly where.
Very
things were
cool.
going.
And that sets up the next question beautifully as well, because you've in the course of your research, you made some discoveries that have actually, in my opinion, kind of contributed to our understanding of the battle. That phase 1B you alluded to in the beginning. So could you kind of set up where the common understanding of the battle before you really started your research and what you identified as some clarifying points about some tactical level action?
Sure. And I mean, and these are really kind of fine detail things. It's not the kind of broad scope stuff, but for one, at Antietam, sort of set up the scene a little bit. So the 12th Corps came in, they started fighting around the cornfield area. The Crawford's Brigade fought for a little bit. Their deployment was not, didn't go off quite as planned, and they ended up falling back before too long. Glossing that really quickly, but I got a long way to go here. The Gordon's Brigade comes in, the veteran portion of his brigade, and they're fighting against Roswell Ripley's brigade, and then after that, Alfred Holt Colquitt's brigade. And so they're at the north end of the cornfield, kind of battling it out. Green's, the two brigades with him, sweep around to Colquitt's right through the East Woods. They clear off some folks that have been in there, some Confederates, and then slam into the Colquitt's right flank. And they actually wrap around the tail end of them. So there's a sort of hand-to-hand fighting for a few minutes, and then a running fight back toward the Dunkerchurch Plateau, which is to the southwest. Confederate artillery there clear off, and Green's people, now out of ammunition, hunker down behind there. And the Confederates fall back out of the way. Some artillery shows up, and they're firing toward the sunken road. Now, this is where things start to change a little bit. They finally get their ammunition, and John Sedgwick's division of the XII Corps shows up, and they're attacking the West Woods. And this is somewhat well known. They're kind of pointed in the wrong direction. They are in a tight massed formation, and Lafayette McLaws's division, just in from Harper's Ferry, slams into their flank heading north. But one of McLaws's brigades, Joseph Kershaw's, they are kind of breaking off to the right, and they go through the East Woods, clear off one regiment from Crawford's brigade that had been sent out there by itself, a new regiment, 125th Pennsylvania, and they go start heading back up the Smoketown Road to the northeast. Just across the Hagerstown Pike from the West Woods and from the Dunkerchurch is Dunkerchurch Plateau, where Green's people are. They just got their ammunition, and the lead regiment of Kershaw's brigade has been sent out to kind of cover the deployment of the rest of the brigade. They're the ones that had driven off the 125th Pennsylvania. Once they do that, they go across the road, and they hunker down near where the Maryland Monument is today, in some rock ledges. And they're firing on the 125th, retreating, on some artillery that's clearing out. And a portion of that regiment sort of looks to the right. They don't really see a lot over there. Some of Green's people actually come out, and not the whole regiment, just the color guard and half of a company. They come out and sort of create an enticing target. And some of these South Carolinians head for them. Some of them break off a little bit further to the right and go for the rightmost section of artillery that's nearest them. So Green's people get up, and they start blasting away at these guys, and they kind of quickly scoot off because they're just way outnumbered. They get back into the woods, and so all that is kind of standard traditional narrative up to this point. The 2nd South Carolina gets to the southern edge of the West Woods, and they see two of their other brigade mate regiments coming up, the 7th and 8th South Carolina. And they do a bit of cheering when they recognize each other. They all go back in. So traditionally, the thought is that, and the standard narrative of this comes from Ezra Carman, who was actually 12th Corps member, did big history on this. There's a missing period in Carman's manuscript that from the end of the 2nd South Carolina going across the road the first time, and it doesn't cover any of the rest of Kershaw's attack. And then after that, Van Manning's brigade comes up and follows Kershaw, and they go in and attack. None of that stuff's in Carman's manuscript. But there are correspondences, like a lot of them, that inform the whole his whole manuscript, and that stuff still exists. So the sources are there. anyways, the traditional narrative is that these three regiments go across the road, basically into the same field that the 2nd South Carolina had been in the first time, and they all attacked together. But based on the letters and actually sources from the 12th Corps and a federal battery that's up near the cornfield, all that sort of ties in together and gives an updated interpretation that the 2nd South Carolina actually went north of the Smoketown Road, which kind of angles it to the northeast, and they go through this swale up a little hill and then swing around and hit almost the flank of Hector Tyndale's brigade, which is the northmost of Greene's 2 brigades that are sitting there. That causes this federal battery to have to clear out. They get back over to near the East Woods, farther to the east of where all this is happening, and that allows the 3rd South Carolina to move from its position. This federal battery had been pinning them down, so they move forward, not quite as far as 2nd South Carolina, but this battery, Woodruffs and Cauthrins, which also had to move back, they are now repositioned by the East Woods, and they start enfilading the 2nd South Carolina, who meanwhile is under infantry fire from the Ohioans on the right of Tyndale's brigade. They had to, shift front to face them a little bit. So that's the portion of it that's sort of new. The 7th and 8th South Carolina do go across in that the field where it was traditionally understood. There's a letter out there that I think Carman based all this on, and like I said, it's not in the manuscript, but you can see on his map, Carman was interpreting it as the 2nd South Carolina going across into this field. The letter basically says, well, the 3 regiments went and attacked together in this glorious thing or whatever. So you think that it's all 3 of them together, but the guy had another letter where he said, I'm kind of heavily paraphrasing here, but we left where our kind of union with these other 2 regiments went around the Dunker Church. Well, to do that, they have to be heading north, not east, and cross the pike to the north of a road that's kind of forking with it at an angle. So that's saying they're going north of the Smoketown Road through a swale. There's a swale in that field, and then up another hill to a fence. So that's going up to the edge of the Smoketown Road and then firing into that right kind of side of Tyndale's brigade. I went kind of long and in the weeds there.
Oh, that's what we do here. So okay. When you were researching this, at what point did that even catch your attention enough that you wanted to dig into that?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I remember that, but it demanded extra attention because it was not in Carman's manuscript. I didn't take anything in Carman kind of wholesale. I looked at all of the letters in the Carman and the Gould papers, which are outstanding sources, by the way. Anybody who wants to look into Antietam has to look at that stuff, the original ones. So I was doing that sort of anyway, but like I said, Carman doesn't cover this at all. I guess I came across that letter, and it seemed to it really stand out. It also after I dwelled on it a bit, it fit in with a letter from somebody from the 7th Ohio, and also Woodruffs official report, which Carman, by the way, Carman puts Woodruff, I believe, in the wrong position. If you look at the Carman coat maps, they've got him down in that swale. And that's based on a source from a member of Woodruff's battery that said, I think it was something like 300 yards or feet, can't remember now, north of the church and 150 to the east. Well, that puts him right where Carman has him. I'm not sure why Carman didn't trust Woodruff's report, which said it was 300 yards from the woods. So the woods does sort of an angle. So the West Woods, a right angle, and there's a field between there and the pike to the east of the woods, and either pointing to the southern edge or the western edge of those woods, like the eastern edge of those woods, you've got 300 yards, and it puts him up on a more of a plateau. You can see straight across the pike because he's supposed to be firing at Barksdale's people and at the 3rd South Carolina. And if he's down in that swale, I stood right there. You he would have needed a spotter and probably a mortar to hit anybody over there. And
that's exactly what I was thinking. A plateau versus a swell.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's exactly what I was thinking. You would think anybody who has any professional background, and you've got to assume that Carmen does at this point, being a member of 12th Corps, that a swell is just, especially in an age of direct fire artillery, that's just not where you're going to place cannon versus a plateau. It's on the face of it. It seems like you would just understand that the swale was not the right location.
Yeah, and that spot where Carmen put him, there's only one place where he can direct his fire, and that's at the Dunker Church. I mean, because there's nothing else. I mean, you got Union off to his left, and so oh, by the way, if the Confederates came up on top of the swale that's like right next to him, they'd be firing down into him, and that's it's a kind of a not a very good situation to be in. Also, in Woodruffs Report, he said, well, these Confederates, they got onto his left, and they were, the intricacies of the terrain basically protected them from his fire, which kind of means they're under him and he can't shoot at them, right? He still could see the Dunker Church because he fired on these people at the Dunker Church. You can still, direct line of fire from up on that plateau. But once they come around on his left, he had to kind of move at that point. And if he were down in that swale, and as you said, Confederates got on his left, they would have been all the way back at the Muma Lane, which is way behind Union lines. And that just doesn't make any sense.
So I'm picturing, as you're reading these letters and doing this research, was this the almost stereotypical, you've got 6 letters tacked to the wall on a map and a bunch of red tape connecting different stuff? How did you connect the dots?
Well, I mean, you have these maps that already existed, right? And so I'm just kind of reading these things over and over again and looking at the map and the topography on it, and then going out to the field too, which that's where kind of I had to go out there and walk the different positions I just talked about in order to really understand and kind of put the nail in that. Now, I'm not going to say there's no chance that the traditional narrative is correct, but I feel pretty confident that this is the way that it actually was.
Has this caused any kind of stir within the Antietam community?
Not yet. So Tom Clemens read it. I sent it to him. I published a whole kind of piece on it in Emerging Civil War a while back, and before I did, I sent it to Tom Clemens to look at, and he thought it made sense. And the manuscript, a couple other folks who are big on Antietam read the manuscript, and nobody's objected yet. So,
well, I mean, it certainly sounds like you put a lot of rigor into it. It's obviously it's not going to change history. What happened, but at the same time, anything that can provide clarification and a deeper understanding of what actually happened is always super welcome. Do you think that from what you've seen out there on the ground, as your book gets more widely read, do you think this will have any impact on the interpretation on the ground? Is there anything that currently states right now, hey, the 2nd South Carolina attacked in this direction that's on a tablet or something that might have to be changed or anything like that? Is it going to have that kind of impact, or is it too much of a micro detail?
I think it might be too much of a micro detail. I'm trying to think about the tablets that are there, and they talk about Kershaw's brigade attacking here. It's kind of at the brigade level, if I remember correctly. Now I know, I've presented to the battlefield guides at Antietam, and talking to a few of them, they said that it's generally well received. So hopefully they're finding stuff that's useful to them.
That's fantastic. Now you've mentioned General Greene a few times. So one thing I found really interesting is what I know mostly about Greene is in the popular imagination is his defense of Culp's Hill, and even that doesn't get as much of the credit as a lot of folks believe it should. Eclipsed by Little Round Top or different things like that. But folks who know him and his defense of Culp's Hill, he always comes off as he's a professional. He's knows what he's about. And I was surprised at least from my reading, that until even Antietam, he was not very well received as a commander by his subordinates. And that shocked me. I was expecting him to be kind of the beloved grandfather of his troops almost. So could you share a little bit more about why? Was he too much of a disciplinarian? Was he too old school till they got into combat? Was it that old story? Or what was the deal with Greene and his troops initially?
Yeah, it was a couple things. And actually there were a couple historic figures that are in the same boat, right? One of his brigade commander, Sector Tyndale, is the exact same story. Well, not the exact same story, it's a little bit different. But so for Greene, yeah, he was thought of as kind of strict, disciplinarian. He didn't, so when he first showed up, this is before the narrative really even kicks off, they just got done with Winchester, and they moved back to that area for a short time. And he was big on preserving Confederate property, the civilians' property in Confederate areas. And, that kind of goes against what Pope was trying to do. But that was the, almost across the board for a little while until Pope showed up. The directive was, okay, well, you're going to, you're not go pilfering and this sort of thing. And so like he made one regiment rebuild a fence that had been taken down for firewood, and stuff like that gave sort of a bad impression to some of the people, because a lot of the lower ranks folks, company grade officers and down, thought that maybe they deserved more than that kind of nice attention. One of the company commanders in a different brigade referred to him as a finicky old jackass, takes all day to do nothing. And I forget the rest of the quote, but it was a great quote. And another person in 27th Indiana talked about him marching his troops like trying to get a stall-fed cow to market. Like he made them keep a certain kind of regime, and actually Stonewall Jackson did similar kind of stuff, really. But it's things like that made folks a little bit, not too close to Greene. Actually, there are a lot of quotes about both him and Tyndale. Like after the battle, after a few hours, they talked about how brave they both are and how great they performed, and it was a big turnaround, especially with Tyndale. But one of the people said, "We're no longer so fierce for hitting Greene with a brick," which I thought was great.
That is a great quote. So I've got just a couple more questions. I know we're almost at the end of our time here. The first question being, I got to go back a little bit because I found this fascinating. It's on page 194 when they're talking. It's it's the 1st of September. The Corps is going into Maryland as part of the Army of the Potomac, and the Corps commander identifies a small 13-man patrol under the command of a sergeant out of the 28th Pennsylvania that sends these guys across enemy lines to check out the Army of Northern Virginia's movements. I had never read anything like that before from a Civil War narrative. This is almost like a long-range reconnaissance patrol that you've got going on in Burma in World War II, or that you read about in Vietnam. Where did you find reference to that patrol? And was that more common than most Civil War histories let on because they're so focused on the big troop movements and battles?
So I don't know if it's more common than let on. You do hear little snippets about just glancing references to trying to send somebody out to collect intelligence, right? But that's kind of all I usually see. I found this in two sources. One is the 28th Pennsylvania's regimental papers at the Pennsylvania Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and then the other one is Ambrose Henry Hayward's letters, which are published actually, but that I was looking at them from Gettysburg College, and Hayward gives a very long kind of description of this in two of his letters, and there's. Let's see. I think also the John Foring papers at Historical Society of Pennsylvania is probably actually where I was seeing it. But they have the list in the regimental papers of the members involved. And I think I had it in an appendix at one point, and it might not have made it to the book. But I found it in those two places. It was really kind of unique. Like you said, I I was kind of astounded by the whole thing, and the story is kind of so rich, really, right? I mean,
Definitely.
they're out there, and they eventually, it's kind of like Alvin York. They had 17 prisoners at one point that they're trying to ferry back, because they're stuck on the wrong side of the lines, and they're down to, I think it was 11 people by this point. They have 17 people with them, and they're walking straight through a bunch of Confederate camps, like campfires and stuff, and they're just pretending that they're Confederates, just going about their way.
That was a highlight of the book for me. That was definitely high adventure, and I think it also just serves as a just to show how well you were able to focus on the operational level and the grand tactical level, talking about the Corps, and then pull up these great human interest stories that were happening down at the soldier level. It was just an excellent juxtaposition of high level stuff and low level stuff, and it was great. But yeah, that really blew my mind. I really enjoyed that inclusion, and I appreciate you putting that in there. Yeah. The last thing I wanted to ask you about was, so you've taken the Corps from its inception through Antietam. Is there any, and you have alluded to the fact you're starting a master's program, or you're in a master's program now, is there any intent for this to be, hey, we're going to have a volume 2 Fredericksburg to Gettysburg, and volume 3 the Western Theater kind of thing about 12th Corps? Is this going to be part of a larger body of work?
So I've started research on another volume that would cover Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and then kind of to the end of the Eastern Theater. So just kind of the activities happening after Gettysburg. In fact, a few of the regiments head up to New York City in response to the draft riots. So I am doing that. I'm very excited about the Chancellorsville stuff in particular, actually. There's a lot of good information there. And it hasn't been covered a lot yet for 12th or even 3rd Corps, which I expect to put some coverage on the 3rd Corps as well.
Very cool.
And the master's degree is all done. So
hey, congratulations.
I'm not allowed to go back to school again. I'm told which is fine, because I've had enough. Right. And I mean, I could foresee the possibility of a Wauhatchie to Ringgold Gap kind of thing too, but that's too far away to
understood.
Say I'm going to do that yet.
Very cool. Well, I'm excited that you are doing Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. I look forward to it greatly. The last question I have for you, and then I'll let you go enjoy your Saturday with your family, is I like to ask this question of anybody that is writing a Civil War book. In the course of this, we've talked about guys like, Banks, we've talked about Pap Green, the names that people know. Is there a 12th Corps soldier that just folks don't know who this guy was, and history deserves to preserve him better? Is there anyone you want to introduce the Civil War public to who's like, yeah, you should know about this guy? Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's some, company level folks that are good, but if I'm going to say somebody that the general public should probably learn about, I'll pick somebody a little higher, I guess. So I'd say, I mentioned him earlier, Hector Tyndale. Him or George Henry Gordon are both kind of ended up being good brigade commanders. So Gordon, he was a highly professional kind of character, created the 2nd Massachusetts, which is a great regiment. And he was not liked by the 27th Indiana, but he was very much liked by the 2nd Massachusetts and the 3rd Wisconsin. He butted heads with Nathaniel Banks quite a lot. He didn't spare him at all, and he didn't have much tact. I kind of think of him as like a good corollary to D.H. Hill, right? So he's kind of prickly. It didn't bite his tongue very well, but he's capable, right?
Gotcha.
In fact, Alpheus Williams, juxtaposing him and Samuel Wiley Crawford, said that Gordon required no watching, which tells you what he thought of Crawford. On the Tyndale side, he had no experience in any of this before the war. He was a merchant, and his people really hated him. I mean, we talk about Greene not having a lot of respect. Some people thought that Tyndale might have gotten fragged by his own people if they got into combat. There's an interesting episode at that 28th July Grand Review where he dresses everybody down in a really kind of harsh way. He did you're not allowed to drink any water from your canteen. I mean, this is a different episode. You're not allowed to have any water on the hot march unless we stop and I tell you to, that kind of stuff. And but that morning at Antietam, everything turned around within like 2 hours, right? Everybody was just gushing. Somebody said, who would have ever thought that we would have cheered for that guy just a couple hours ago? And there's a lot of comments like that. Now he ends up getting really badly wounded at Antietam, and two of the people in the 28th Pennsylvania that you wouldn't have expected, because that was his old regiment, you wouldn't have expected people to do this, but they run out 50 yards under fire and bring back what they think is his dead body. And you don't see a lot of that in the Civil War either, right? So to do that for somebody that they hated so much, and one of those guys was one of the folks that was on that reconnaissance that you were talking about earlier, and the other one was a captain who had taken a flag off of a Confederate color bearer that morning. So these two guys had a pretty eventful day.
That sure sounds like it. Holy cow. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on and giving us the breakdown of the book. Once again, the author is Chris Bryan, and the book is Cedar Mountain to Antietam. I got to get better lighting, guys. I apologize. Here we go. Cedar Mountain to Antietam. You can get it through Savas Beatie Books, which I always have plenty of time for. A great independent publisher. I highly recommend you purchase it directly from the publisher. And so any parting words, Chris?
No, just thank you very much for having me. I hope everybody enjoys the book.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, sir. You have a great day.
You too. Thanks.